Hey guys, welcome back to another Q&A. It is May 3rd, 2020, and this week was an open Q&A, and there are a lot of really good questions. I'm actually pretty excited about this one, so let's see. And don't mind, I'm all sweaty and just got done training, so I'm gonna try to get through this here. Let me see. Okay. So we'll start on Instagram. First question is sodium to potassium ratio. What amounts do you suggest being added to food per day? All right, so on that, well, first, ratios are going to vary a little bit. A lot of people can start around a 1-to-1, and that's a decent place to start for most people. It seems to work okay, and then you can kind of manipulate from there. You would also want to know if the person's enhanced, are they using anything that is going to change that ratio of sodium potassium retention? Like growth hormone, for example, would be the main one for most people, just because you're going to be more sodium retentive at that point. And then outside of that, you would just have to manipulate the ratio based on what kind of pumps you're getting and how you feel on it, fullness, hydration. But adding to food, you want to also look at what is your food intake like. So if you're eating your typical bodybuilding type foods, you're probably going to have a higher potassium intake. Veggies, even certain carb sources, especially if you're eating things like potatoes, even meat has a decent amount of potassium in it in comparison to sodium. So your diet would probably be relatively low sodium. And now if you're eating a little more processed food in the diet, then it's going to be potentially a little higher sodium. So consider that. If you are really way off or eating, super clean food, I guess if you want to call it that, then you're probably going to be a little higher potassium. Keep that in mind. Now, if you're just simply adding it, also look at how big are you. A smaller person, maybe somebody like 180 pounds and below, they might want to start at like 5 or 6 grams, 1-to-1. And then I've even had people upwards of like 8, 9, 10 grams, 1-to-1, depending on the person, depending on what kind of area they live in, depending on their fluid intake, how much they sweat, all that good stuff, what kind of foods they're eating. So you'd be somewhere in that range and you can adjust up. I mean, a person with pretty healthy kidneys is going to regulate that stuff. They're going to excrete it, especially if you're drinking high water, high fluid intake. It's going to balance out pretty well. So keep that in mind, and that's more or less how you're going to determine it. But yeah, I'd probably start right around a 1-to-1 for most people, except for those on the certain compounds, like I said. So next one, consideration indicators with new movement selections and when to rotate exercises once a plateau is reached for a few weeks, joint or tissue pain when executed the movement, etc. So those things, yeah. I mean, if you're not making any progression on the movement, you can do poundage wise. You can obviously do things like try to clean up the execution, make it better, not necessarily more weight, but better. If it's causing you pain on a regular basis, then that may not be the best movement for you anyhow, unless mechanically you're not executing it very well. But yeah, I mean, if your goal is progression in terms of overload, then yeah, I mean, you're not going to want to sit stagnant on a movement for weeks and weeks and weeks. That doesn't necessarily mean if you have a 1 week where you don't, or 1 session where you don't hit a PR, then you have to change it. No. Once you're starting 2 or 3 sessions and nothing's really happening and you're executing it well, then yeah, you're probably going to want to rotate movements to something similar. And it doesn't have to be a drastic rotation movement. It can be changing the angle a little bit. It can be using a different bar. It can be changing the tension curve, using bands and chains, something like that, changing the rep range. And there's a lot of things you can do to make it different, right? There's a lot of things you can do to make the movement different. And then from there, try to restart progression, right? So yeah, that's what you're going to look at. Are you making any type of progression with good execution? If the movement's causing you pain, then you probably shouldn't do it, or you should figure out what, execution wise, what's going wrong. And those are going to be the main things. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the biggest things. If you're progressing on something on a regular basis all the time, you probably don't need to mess with it much. Refeeds while in a diet phase. Can this be pretty well... This can be a pretty well accepted tactic. Can you explain benefits or considerations when doing a refeed while in a surplus, but trying to get your metab to budge down? Not sure exactly what the asking on that, but if you're already in a calorie surplus, then doing a refeed isn't going to have a lot of metabolic benefit. You shouldn't really have any type of major metabolic downregulation when you're in a calorie surplus anyhow, because you are in a calorie surplus, right? You're not restricting. That's not going to create those adaptions, so you shouldn't have to worry about it. If you want to use something like a free meal, a calorie influx on certain days, just as a psychological thing, or maybe around days that you train bigger body groups, if you notice that it helps you, stuff like that's okay. It's fine to do. In the right context again, but an actual refeed, a more extended refeed that's used for metabolic purposes isn't going to be necessary in a surplus. There's not really any major metabolic benefit at that point. If anything, if you're already eating a lot, you don't want any more metabolic increase. Thoughts on programming of full body workouts in regards to your experience on efficacy of these splits, exercise order, total volume, recovery required between said sessions. There is a lot of, there has to be a lot of context there. So can you program full body successfully? Absolutely yes. There are the higher frequency, lower volume splits where they program it that way. It is fine to do that. Now, there are some things I would consider when doing it. What is your exercise selection? What do you feel like during the session? You mentioned exercise order, which is important. Hardest thing for me personally would be, especially if I'm training with higher intensity, is that if I'm doing even one exercise per body part and doing one working set per body part, by the time I get to the end or even 3/4 of the way through, I am just going to be spent. And the amount of effort, I can put in good effort, but it's just not going to be much output, right? My output's going to be low because I'm just so tired. If you're really beating yourself up, I'll give you an example. So we take a 2-way DC split. That's the way that it's written normally. It's basically the whole body split into 2 workouts. Even by the end of that, I'm just toast. So can you do full body? Yes. Can you execute at high intensity? Yes. Should you be careful with exercise selection and order? Yes. Because if you are going in and you are doing, major muscle groups, bis, tris, delts, back, pecs, shoulders, however you want to break it up, quads, hamstrings, if you're doing a major movement for all those body parts, you're going to be just destroyed and probably not going to be able to put much effort in as you get further into the workout. So something you might want to do is use compound movements for some of the body parts, and use single joint movements for some of the body parts, and then maybe the next session you can rotate it and give more of a compound movement focus to those opposing parts, and then more of the single joint movements to the other parts. Flip-flop it, and so you could do something like that. It's probably going to be not a ton of total sessions per week. It would still be higher frequency because it's full body, but probably not a ton of total sessions per week, because you're going to need recovery between workouts, maybe at least 2 days, depending on the person. And it's going to, like I said, it's just going to depend on the exercise. It will really boil down to the amount of intensity and exercise selection. Lots of very high ROI exercise, return on investment, things like squats and things like big heavy presses and things like barbell rows and dumbbell rows and stuff like that. That's going to really be taxing. You're going to have a hard time getting through a whole entire session doing all those types of movements and hitting every single one of those body parts with the same type of intensity and effort output. It's just going to be tough. You're just going to be drained. So I would consider that. But can it be done? For sure. You could do it kind of like I mentioned earlier, like flip-flopping compound and single joint, and doing like an A1 B1 A2 B2 type of thing. Or it wouldn't be that. It would be an A1 and an A2, I guess. Something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of variables there to consider. Next one, do you find it optimal in terms of both long-term health and physique progression to use GH and insulin, Lantus or Humalog on a daily basis, or a focus basis, lagging body part training days? No, I mean, GH and combined with insulin has the synergy with IGF primarily, and obviously the insulin helps control the blood sugar increase. And I mean, insulin is just going to be used as an as needed basis, right? To partition, help, keep glucose levels in check. And so if you're eating, I mean, I guess that would work for the lagging body parts. If you're eating a lot more on those days and you wanted to use it that way, then sure. But if you're eating like the same amount on training days, then no. You're probably going to want to use it on all the training days at least, or all the higher carbohydrate intake or all the higher calorie intake days, because it's going to be there to control blood glucose levels, right? That's going to be healthier, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. If you take someone that uses a GH and eats a lot of food and they go through a long, hard growth phase, then they might see really highly increased blood glucose levels, and they're going to have a hard time resetting afterwards. Whereas someone that had used sufficient amounts of exogenous insulin throughout the whole thing would have supported their pancreas and not like smoked all their beta cells in their pancreas. So once they come down on food and they pull all that stuff out, their pancreas is able to function normally, and it's not just completely crushed. So it would depend on food intake. That part would depend on food intake and need of insulin to control blood glucose more so than it would whether you want to use it to help grow or not. Yes, adding in the GH would heighten blood glucose, so you would have a higher insulin need throughout the day. And so yeah, but that it would, so again, it would be more so dependent on food intake and blood glucose levels more than anything else. But if you want to use it just like on all training days, then just use it on all the training days, or all the days that it's higher, all the days that you need it there to control blood glucose, and then GH just is used on those days as well. I hope that makes sense. Maybe I would be easier to answer that question if I actually saw how the nutrition was structured, but I think that answer should make sense, hopefully. Okay. Also, incorporate reset days and off-season meal planning. Would you keep the macros at a constantly changing maintenance intake or a fixed deficit? So he says, as opposed to a constant daily push, building in days where you go protein veggie or protein fat only from the get-go and prevent hitting a wall from an off-season push. Yeah, absolutely you could. I don't see any issue with that. I mean, you could use the simple like training and non-training day rotation where you go higher and lower right off the get-go. I mean, the only thing you're running into obviously is if total caloric need is very, very high. That gets a little bit trickier, because on the days that you are eating more food, you might be eating a lot more food because those reset days are taking away from the total surplus. So, if your total caloric needs are, I don't know, 7 days, so like 50,000 calories for a week, and you have 3 days a week, or we'll just say 2 days a week where you only eat 2,000 calories, then you just have a lot to make up. You're eating like 8,000 or 9,000 calories in the other days or something ridiculous, right? So that would be really the only issue there. Is it maybe a good thing to do right off the bat? Yeah, I think as long as you can get away with it and it's not just a matter of you have to get more food in so it gets harder to incorporate those days, I think that's fine. So like essentially I would do it in my last high food push. My food was very, very high. Now my off days also got pretty high. I started with them a lot lower to do exactly what you're talking about. But my caloric needs were so high that my off days also got high. And all I would do is just periodically throw in these reset days, and I would just do a fast. I'd fast for, pretty much 24 hours. So if I ate like 9 o'clock the night before, I'd fast from then all the way to the next night at 9, maybe have one meal and go to bed. And that was just something that's thrown in as needed. It wouldn't be every single rest day or even every week, simply because, the more I did it, the more that my higher, food days would need to go up and up and up and up to offset that. So that's the only thing I would really think about, is how much is it going to cut into your total surplus. But yeah, as a tool to help maintain GI health and blood glucose and all that stuff, yeah, it's great. And if you can get away with it, then do it. Rack pulls, deadlifts, T-bar rows on 3 separate days for 2-way DC split as the primary back thickness exercises. Yeah, so like a DC that has an A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, though rack pulls and deadlifts kind of redundant. Granted, a rack pull and a deadlift might have slightly different muscle recruitment because you're pulling from different heights, and depending on your structure, you might recruit different muscles, different heights. Maybe if you pull lower, it might turn into more of a hip dominant, like a glutes and hams and stuff, and pull more with that. And from a higher height, you might recruit actually more back. So I would just look at like what you need to accomplish with that. Personally, if I was going to do any type of pulling movement, maybe it was a rack pull, I'd probably leave the T-bar rows in. I'd probably pull either the rack pull or deadlift out and only leave one of the pulling movements, and then add in another thickness exercise, some kind of rowing. Put T-bar row. So if that's like a narrow or mid grip T-bar row, then I might do something like a dumbbell row with a different grip, like maybe a neutral grip on this one, like a dumbbell bilateral row, chest supported or head supported or something like that, versus having 2 posterior chain movements. Now, if your posterior chain really sucks ass, then I guess that's, you could do both. That would be fine. But for back thickness, I'd probably have like 2 rowing type exercises and probably 1 pulling exercise, to be honest. And the pulling is going to be so CNS taxing too, so keep that in mind. How to get the most tissue growth. Let's see. Oh no. How to get the most tissue growth post-contest rebound, training, diet, subs. I usually are trying to get healthy at this point, but what if you wanted to push longer here? Any benefit? It's a really loaded question. How to get the most is gonna depend on a lot of things. But so in a nutshell, let's think about the situation real quick. So you've gone through the prep. You are probably, body's pretty stressed out. There's probably a decent amount of inflammation. You've probably already, if you're enhanced, you've probably already been on supplementation. Okay. What else do we know that's positive? You're very insulin sensitive. Nutrient partitioning is very good. You're also weak, which isn't a bad thing because that means your strength's going to go up pretty easily. You're also eating lower calories, which is a good thing also because your food intake's going to go up. So while this isn't a perfect period for growth, it is a pretty good opportunity. Now, what also happens as you get further into this? Partitioning starts to go down as you gain a little body fat back. Partitioning starts to go down as your food intake has been higher for longer, right? That rebound and filling out aspect and all that stuff, it eventually will start to fade out. You'll start to spill. You'll start to gain a little more body fat, right? That's normal. And you're also going to start to get that strength plateaus. You're going to start to strength plateau. That easy strength gains that you got because you're weak are eventually going to slow down. So think about that. Now, if you were to get healthier after the show and just focus on regaining strength, being progressive with food, and then maybe use something like growth hormone and insulin that are going to take advantage of partitioning and help you grow, but still let your lipid profile come back and all that stuff, you're going to get a lot of growth out of that. And then when your progress stops, you're fresh, you're ready to go. Your CNS is healed, your blood work is good, all that stuff. And then you can add the additional compounds back in. So your progress went like this, right? It went up, 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 slowed, and then you add it back in, it goes up again, right? And then you can extend the growth phase for a really long time versus adding it all right in out of the gate. So maybe you go up just a little bit more, and instead of peaking here, you peak right here. But then, my health sucks. I can't make any more progress. I can't add anything else in. So we got to go back down, right? So, it kind of defeats the purpose at that point. Personally, now, if the person had an easy prep and their body's not super toxic and they're feeling good, then yeah, you could probably push out longer. But if they're really, if they push themselves hard, like majority of people have to do, and they've been using other PEDs and stuff, you're probably going to get more out of rebounding like that, and then pushing up even more once things slow down. So just kind of depends on what the prep was like and how hard the person had to push. But those are some things to consider. So hope that helps you guys, and I will talk to you next week.